welcoming folks. Who do you see on the call?
We're good. Let's go.
Yay. Nice, welcome.
Great, great, great. A wonderful day it is. I hope you're doing well. I hope everybody's fine. Even if there's something happening, as the song says, we are moving on. It's going to be fine. Okay. So welcome to our Leadership Happy Hour. We do this the last Friday of every month, and it's just a wonderful space to talk about leadership issues. For today, we are looking at a very interesting topic, something that we have not actually been talking about too well, but it is a need that we need to address. And so today we are doing that. And for our topic, we are looking at closing the disability gap with effective leadership. This is brought to you by the Busara Africa family. I am not alone. I am here with my whole team, especially the evergreen Taaka Awori. I have Lydia. I have so many people around, and we're going to do an introduction later on. But we want to find out, what is disability or being differently abled? Okay, that is what we're going to talk about today. What is disability or being differently abled? And we say that being differently abled is when you have a condition of the body or mind that makes it more difficult for you with the condition to do certain activities and interact with the world around you. Now, it could be an impairment, it could be an activity limitation, it could also be participation restriction. But whatever it is, we have to discuss it. And so, hello, Taaka, where are you?
Thanks so much, Vera. And just lovely to see you all from your different spaces. Lovely to see you, Rachel in the UK, Stigmata in Tanzania, Bekue in South Africa, Betty in Nairobi, Vivian here in Accra, Donna Marie in the UK, Flavia in Brussels, Branford and Daniel, I'm assuming here in Accra. So Matthew from here. So we're from all over, and just lovely to see you all. A huge welcome. Huh? So as Vera said, we're really having a conversation today that I think we don't have often enough. Huh? And I'll tell you why we're having this conversation. Huh? Increasingly, I know all of you keep hearing about how it's so important for us to talk about diversity and inclusion. Huh? But usually when you find us talking about diversity and inclusion, often you see we're talking about potentially gender or race, huh? But not often enough we are talking about disability. And I'm going to open the discussion with a few stats to show you why we need to be having this conversation on disability. Huh? For one, over 1.3 billion people, according to the 2021 report by World Economic Forum, over 1.3 billion people live with some form of disability. So we're talking about 17% of the global population. So in other words, that's the largest minority group. Huh? The other thing is that people with disabilities often lack, as you can well imagine, access to employment, and therefore the current global employment rate for disabled people is just half of that for people who are not living with disabilities. Eh? And even when they're employed, people with disabilities often experience unequal hiring and promotion standards. Eh? And again, so many of our companies and organizations say, yeah, we prioritize diversity. And yet this study found that only 4% of businesses are focused on making offerings inclusive of diversity. So in other words, either we're not talking about it, or when we talk about it, we just talk, we don't act. Huh? So this is why we're having the discussion today. And we recognize that to have this discussion, we need to bring in the experts. We need to bring in people who are working on this on a day-to-day basis. So we're really excited and honored and already thank in advance our guests who accepted to join us for this leadership happy hour. We have Madam Rita Kusi, who's the Executive Director of the Ghana Federation of Disabled. So Madam Rita, thank you so much for being here. We're really honored to have you here with us today. Yeah?
Hi,
Welcome.
my pleasure, Taaka.
Vera?
Welcome, Rita. How are you today?
I'm doing very well, and I'm happy to be part of this conversation today. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for making time for us on a Friday like this.
You see?
But we really want to know a little bit more about your organization, the mandate, and then your work so far.
Okay, thank you very much, Vera, and Taaka and your team for this great opportunity for us to learn and share. The Ghana Federation of Disability Organizations is a national umbrella of disabled people organizations who work to promote inclusion and participation of persons with disabilities in the Ghanaian society. We are located in Accra. We have a national office, but we are located again in about 10 regions in Ghana and in more than 236 districts. So these branches are representing the interest of persons with disabilities in their communities. For our work, we mainly advocate for governance, inclusion, so generally on inclusive governance, looking at how Ghanaian society, the political system, and the governance system will be inclusive. So we influence policies and programs for the benefit of persons with disabilities. Since we are an umbrella organization, we also empower our member organizations. And these organizations are made up of distinct disability groups. So for instance, we have Ghana Blind Union, being a member of our organization, Ghana Society of the Physically Disabled. We have National Association of the Deaf. We have Mental Health Society of Ghana. And in general, we are made up of 9 national organizations. And I can go on with the list, but due to time, basically that's what we do. In terms of our work, we have worked to influence our national medium-term strategy to ensure that disability is inclusive. Our elections processes in Ghana, the national election, the political, presidential, and parliamentary elections, we've ensured that the whole process and the system is inclusive for persons with disabilities. We have worked at the local level to influence local policies for representation and participation of persons with disabilities at the community level. We can talk about many of our achievements and the work that we do, but basically just for the time that we have, I'll limit it for now. Yeah, thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah.
So just by listening to you, Rita, and you can see on the call, we have leaders from really across the continent. We have folks in the US and Europe. And I think just by the work that the Federation does and the type of members you have, I think you're going to have lots of advice for us today in terms of how we can be more disability inclusive leaders. Huh? But maybe my first question to you, Rita, is when we talk about people with disabilities, who do we mean? Because I was already hearing something just by hearing the type of membership you have, but start to help us understand who do you include in that terminology of people living with disabilities?
All right, Taaka. In fact, when Vera was giving the introductory remarks, I realized it's a good one. But in defining disability, you don't put the emphasis on the person's impairment. So generally, A person with disability is someone who has physical, mental, and sensory impairments in whose daily lives we can see some limitation. And that limitation comes as a result of the barriers in our society. So first, the impairment is defined, plus the barriers make a disability. So people who come through this experience are people we describe as persons with disability. And the officially accepted description is persons with disability. Sometimes we try to, based on the capacities of people, say they are differently abled people, but officially we are persons with disabilities. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that. Now we are becoming more mindful of how to actually speak about it. And so I also want to find out, why should we be having this conversation? Although we know the stats, why should we be having it, if from your perspective?
Well, this conversation is important because globally, the whole agenda of inclusion, it has become important because everyone has to be part. We need to work towards ensuring that no one is left behind. And so being more inclusive creates an opportunity for persons with disabilities to fully participate in society without barriers. So it's important that we build that confidence, we build that awareness, so that in our institutional activities and conversations, we take that conscious step to be inclusive, so that persons with disabilities are not left behind in our society. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You know, I have another question. We're hoarding the question, folks, and I hope you will also start to come in with your questions, huh? Because as we're going along, I know I'm learning so much just as Rita is talking. Huh? Yeah. Rita, you said something really interesting in terms of your definition. Huh? You said that the disability comes from a combination of two things, huh? The impairment, huh? But also then the limitations within society. Huh? Mm. So I love what you're bringing up, is that many times it's because within society, we are not creating inclusive spaces. We're not working inclusively. And so therefore the impairment then that becomes problematic. Huh? But so as we start to recognize that it is important to be inclusive leaders, huh? What would you recommend if you had to give some very practical suggestions to the leaders on this call? What are a few handful of suggestions for us to start to begin? Sorry, Branford. Can someone help me to mute Branford? Got it. The joys of technology. So it's almost like, again, what would be the kinds of things we would need to do, Rita, for us to start on that journey to become more disability inclusive leaders? What practical recommendations would you have? And folks, also start to bring in your comments or calls. We're so privileged to have Rita here. So do bring in your comments and questions.
All right, thank you, Taaka. To be more inclusive, it all starts with a self-awareness, and that is part of the conversation today, being self-aware of the need to include. Then we look at where our spaces are. What space do we find ourselves? Is it in the institution? Within the institution, we need to begin to look at our policies, our internal policies. How do we ensure that it is inclusive, it caters for issues of disability, creates space for persons with disabilities to be part of the institution? So that conscious effort it's very important. You know, sometimes it's said that disability is expensive to manage. And so for some institutions, they wouldn't make that attempt to include, but it is never expensive. It becomes expensive when it's an afterthought. So when you are planning and you are self-conscious of the need to include, you put everything together in the plan. You don't separate issues of disability or things that has to do with disability inclusion. And so it is important that in our planning, we plan with disability inclusion in mind. We ensure we have the policies. We ensure that in the implementation, again, we keep track on disability inclusion. So generally, it's more of that conscious effort at every stage of our development or of our setup in the institution. The other important part of inclusion is, as much as possible, getting persons with disabilities to be represented. So in our institutions, sometimes we don't have friendly policies that open up for persons with disabilities to even apply for the jobs. Most employers see the impairment first without thinking of what the individual will be able to do. And so that kind of mindset then influences every decision and action that leader will take or the institution takes. So it's working towards the kind of negative perception we have about disability and seeing disability as anybody's lot, meaning that at any point in time, we can all be persons with disabilities. And so in our planning, it has to be part of it. Again, I mean, putting the institutional context, it is important that in our programming, we identify the gaps and barriers that will help in bringing persons with disabilities to the same level as others without disabilities. This is because persons with disabilities have been denied the opportunity for a long time. So the opportunity to learn, that opportunity to participate and benefit from some capacity building opportunities and other major activities of their lives. And so when persons with disabilities are employed in institutions, it's important that we pay attention to their capacities, pay attention to the gaps, and plan with them to address those gaps. So these are the immediate, again, I mean, the last point before perhaps we move to the next question is about ensuring that in our monitoring, in our reporting, there is a clear pointer on disability. So at different units in the institution, if we keep track on issues of disability and participation and the contributions of persons with disabilities in our institutions, I think we will feel more confident to create more opportunities for persons with disabilities. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rita. We are learning so much today about planning beforehand, which is one of the major things that we need to be doing. So thank you for pointing out this. I see a lot of comments coming in, and I hope if you're on Facebook or with us on Zoom, you can also let us know if you have already taken steps, maybe in your organization, you're already taking steps to create that inclusiveness in your organization. Let us know how you're doing it. We want to be more interactive. I see a hand up, but before I take the hand, let me read just a few comments, then I'll take the hand. I'm sure you would want to support. Let's see. We have one here. Barita, you're doing well. Yeah. You have Daniel saying hello, Mr. Ejekum Daniel saying hello from Eastern Region. Okay. There's a question that says, thanks, Rita. Can you give some practical examples of how institutions can be more inclusive, which Rita has started? Gillian says, I applaud KFC, which goes out of its way to hire hearing impaired staff. Okay, thank you for that. She also says, I think while some companies may want to create room for people with disabilities, the physical building are not conducive to bring such people in. So this is also a hindrance in hiring people with disability. Very true, very, very true. So we want some more. Yes, there's one also from Judy. Judy says, what is the relationship between the organization and government? Has it been successful in influencing national policy? I'm sure national policy on disability inclusiveness. Has it been, has the organization been able to make strides on its own? If so, how? Okay. Rita, that brings me to a question that says, how long have you been advocating and being on this journey yourself?
Yeah, but maybe before we take that, those hands have been up for a while then, eh? So maybe let's have Donna Marie's hand has been up for a while, and Abigail. Okay. So Rita, you can take them all together, huh? All right. Donna Marie?
Donna Marie?
Hiya. Hi. I had a question, and as Rita spoke, she mentioned a word which sort of links in with my question, perceptions. I think a lot of education needs to be done. One of the concerns I have within Africa, especially because outside of Africa in the West, in terms of disability and inclusiveness, we've kind of got our act together. But within Africa, first of all, it's how we perceive people who are disabled, for a start, whether it's physical or in terms of the different kind of categories that Rita gave. People generally do not understand what the disability involves. They view people with a disability almost as subhuman, and that's a fact. We see them on the side of the street begging. For all you know, one of those people could be somebody who could find a cure for cancer. It just so happens that due to the circumstances, for whatever reason, they find themselves in the position that they're in. But I feel that in order for the organizations to make greater strides, the people need to be educated. And I'll be honest with you, until you mentioned all these organizations, Rita, I hadn't even heard about them. Had never heard about them. And I find that concerning because, this is something that should be in everybody's mind all the time, these organizations and how to draw people in. Somebody mentioning the buildings, for example. Yes, none of our buildings are wheelchair friendly, are they? I mean, there's no thought put into that when structures go up. We have stairs, we have, I don't know what, but we don't have ramps so that there can be wheelchair access. But what's the point? Most organizations are not even hiring people with a disability. So all of this needs to be worked on and changed. And, education is key. Educating the masses. That's just the comment I wanted to make.
Thank you, Donna Marie. Abigail.
Abigail.
Hello, I'm Abigail Bergerson from the African Women's Development Fund. I've been on and off because of power issues. So I was on the phone and I've just come on the laptop. I hope my colleagues have, if they have contributed a lot, then I can keep quiet. But if not, I can go ahead. Okay, yeah. Okay, for the African Women's Development Fund, we are a grant-making organization and our work supports women in disability. So to begin with, we give grants to organizations with disability. Inclusiveness is a key value for AWDF. So for us as an organization also, we have to look inside us to see how well we manifest our value or live our value as an inclusive organization. And fortunately, we were able to raise funds, specifically apart from giving grants, to raise funds to support our organization, actually strengthen our work around disability. And this is involved a number of practices in terms of for the external surface, communications have had to actually work with people outside to work and design our website. Fortunately, we had support also from the Ghana Association of the Disabled, particularly the Deaf Association. Somebody volunteered, their IT person worked with our communications team to enable our website to be accessible to persons of that nature. We also have, we've had an internal organizational training by Dr. Nami from the University of Ghana, who's an expert in itself in disability. That speaks to access, what has been spoken about in terms of our knowledge and understanding, the access, the things we put in the way that we need to know. And I'm telling you, when you go through that, you would even see so much in your new house you have built today that is not functional. Should you just sleep tomorrow? You know, that enlightened us about not only how we engage with people, how we speak about people, our proverbs, our beliefs, our practices, the kind of things we say that we have inherited in the land of the blind. The one-eyed man is a king. You know, those kind of things. Before a blind man says you throw a stone at you, he's stepping on them. When you go through these sort of trainings, you get the consciousness of how difficult it is for persons with disabilities, just even by living and associating with that. But in terms of system structures, AWDF also put on, has worked and is still finalizing a disability policy, and our HR manager is on the call. She can add on to it as part of our processes. We also had someone, a visually impaired person, intern in our offices a few years ago, which also was a spotlight for us in terms of how we relate to them, whether our building is friendly, accessible to persons of different disability orientations. And that was also part of our learning, but then opening up our space gradually. And one of the last things I can talk about is designing our building now. And it's all part of the grant we've had to work on.
Oh, the internet, I think, is giving her a challenge.
Yeah.
Abigail?
As I take it to enable the organization function well, that is to live our value and to ensure that we treat every woman as equal. Thank you. My colleagues can add on.
Fantastic. Oh, thank you so much, Abigail, for that sharing. I think what Abigail is bringing out so powerfully, before I hand it back to you, Rita, is this whole idea and a very concrete example from the African Women's Development Fund of how you actually are able to become more inclusive from the perspective of disabilities, first working internally. And I think they're doing a lot of what you've suggested, Rita, in terms of looking at your policies, looking at your hiring, doing the training so that staff are aware. So you do the internal work, looking at how you communicate, your website, is it accessible? Those kinds of concrete things. And then you do the external facing. You know, for them, it's they're thinking about their grantees. For a business, it might be your customers. Huh? For someone else, it might be your, you know, whoever is your clients. Huh? So it's you're thinking at both levels in terms of inclusivity. So it's so nice to see a concrete example of that. But what again, Abigail is raising is the challenges. And Donna Maria, we're doing this in a context where our society has so many hang-ups, prejudices, stereotypes about people living with disabilities. You know, the proverbs that Abigail mentioned, it's so true. We just say these completely inappropriate things. Huh? So thank you for those examples. Huh? Back to you, Rita, in terms of thoughts, comments on what's been raised.
Yeah, so thank you very much. I think this conversation is really going well, and I'm happy to hear from participants what's happening and what their views are. There was a comment on the interest of companies to hire, but the physical environment does not give room for hiring. In fact, this is a critical issue. We have examples of big corporations who have tried, and I mean, not promoting a particular company, but for instance, Unilever started with us to be inclusive, Unilever Ghana. So they wanted to understand what disability inclusion means, like what we're having today. So we had to organize a whole orientation session for a team. So that started about 2 years ago. And from there, they did an assessment of the physical environment and the system to identify what is there to limit people from working with them, people with disability from working with them. And so they worked towards putting in the necessary accessibility features and provisions. So now they have started with interns. They've hired interns to help them understand how their system is inclusive. And so the plan is that they move to getting more permanent staff. And so it's a challenge, but that self-consciousness, it's very important. Again, we have laws in Ghana that, for instance, in Ghana, I know we have participants from other countries, but in Ghana, we have laws that require, employers or owners of public facilities to ensure their buildings are accessible and their environments are accessible. But these laws are not being adhered to. And so we have people, institutions who have been taken on by individuals with disability because they are not friendly enough. Sometimes people with disability put in the application, but as I indicated, the more negative perception about disability limits them from moving on to the next stages of the interview process, for instance. And so we have issues to do with the physical environment, which we propose that that self-consciousness and planning and conversations with persons with disabilities and disabled people organizations to put a plan together. Definitely, because it was not part of the original plan of the institution, it's going to be expensive. Because I earlier indicated that managing disability becomes expensive when it's an afterthought. So institutions should bear that cost that comes with it. And so that's the point. There was another point about the relationship between our institution and government. We are a civil society organization, but we are made up of users of goods and services of government. So more of persons with disabilities who are the users have come together to form the organization. And for instance, we have some organizations who were set up in the 60s. Some were set up in the 70s. Our organization was set up in the 80s, 1987. But the reality is that it's really taking time for even the organizations to be accepted and recognized as groups of people who have the capacity to influence and contribute to society. So it's growing now. As I indicated, inclusion has become a big agenda now. And so persons with disabilities are continuing the advocacy for their full inclusion and participation in our society. So we are a civil society organization. We work to influence this. So specifically, I talked about the Ghana's medium-term development plan from 2006. We have worked with government on this, and most of the disability inclusive components were made with inputs from disabled people organizations. We have worked to get Ghana to adopt a Disability Act. The first draft was developed by persons with disabilities themselves. It was shared with government and the advocacy continued. And now Ghana has a Disability Act. We went further to work together our government to ratify the UN Convention on Disability. We realized that there are some gaps in our Disability Act, and with the coming in of the UN Convention, it is important that we work towards getting government to review our acts to be compliant with the convention, and that we are working on. We submitted a draft proposal to government. And beyond this, we have a statutory grant that goes to persons with disabilities called the Common Fund for Persons with Disabilities. It's part of the grant that goes to local government for local development. And 3% of this grant has been set aside for persons with disabilities. And we started the advocacy on this in 2006, when we thought that in the medium-term plan, there was disability inclusion, but there was no clear budget for support of implementation of those provisions. So through the advocacy, we realized that we got government to commit to say, we will commit 0.0 to 0.5% of the budget to local government to persons with disabilities. But again, we realized there were many issues. So we worked towards getting government to be firm to say that we're giving you this percentage, for which reason we felt we could easily monitor the allocations and its impact on persons with disabilities. And in 2010, a national policy was adopted for the management and disbursement of that grant for persons with disabilities. And the policy was drafted by our organization. So there are many policies that we have worked on with government.
Nice. Thank you so much, Rita. And I think there's so much learning for folks from other countries in terms of the kind of advocacy you've done to get the right legislation in place, the policies in place. And then I'm sure we know how all our governments have PhDs in policy formulation, then implementation becomes the big question. So I know you're doing lots of advocacy around that. Yeah. I see Flavia has her hand up, so I want to make sure we give Flavia a chance. Flavia, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm happy to be here today and to follow this conversation. I just wanted to add a perspective now that we are addressing leaders within organizations and institutions. I think it's important that we remember that our responsibility and area of influence is not just within the institutions that we lead, but we have an opportunity to also influence around us. I'll just give you a couple of examples. As a leader in organizations, be it corporate or non-corporate, you're able to decide where you take your business. You're able to decide who you procure for services and to what extent they are actually inclusive in their practices. To what extent is the hotel that you're taking your workshop accessible in terms of infrastructure? To what extent are your service providers inclusive in their practices? So I think sometimes we really limit ourselves in terms of our ability to influence those around us and don't realize the power that we hold as leaders and as people who are running institutions or in a position of determining how our money is spent. So if you're in corporate, if you're Coca-Cola, if you're whatever, you're in telecoms, if you're an NGO that is always in hotels, do you check to see that your service providers have practices that are inclusive to all groups? So that's the first point I wanted to say, just to really open our minds in terms of the influence that we hold as leaders. Then the second point is to say that sometimes I think we really we need to look beyond the physical infrastructure. There's so many, impairments or people who are differently abled who are quote unquote invisible, simply because of the nature of the disability. And I'm thinking especially about neurodivergent people who are not neurotypical, for example, autism, ADHD, etc. And some of these groups are actually, if you ask me, a gold mine. If you do to demonstrate that some of these impairments are actually a blessing to so many people, including to institutions. So if you're looking for your brilliant tech person, etc., many of them are actually neurodivergent people. So I think there's something to be said around the person who raised the point around perception and awareness. I think it's so important that as leaders, we also seek to explore what does this mean and what are the potential, because I've seen a company, for example, here in Belgium that tries to hire as many people on the autism spectrum as possible because they're looking for a particular profile that is so in line with the kind of work that they do in tech, because they tend to be the ones who are able to do certain kind of things. So I think it's important to really break down, that information gap and stigma, and really explore and see to what extent we can work with a diverse group of people, even to the benefit of, if for those who are looking for, it makes business sense, for those who need that kind of, what do you call it, convincing, but ideally it shouldn't be that should not be the ground. But for those who are looking at, always, what is in it for me, that's also a one way to pass through that conversation. So yeah, just those two reflections around that. Thank you.
So interesting. Thank you, Flavia. You've really brought in such powerful dimensions. First, it is indeed true. We had been almost limiting ourselves, thinking in terms of our staff as we were talking, or just our, our customers, clients. But I think what you're bringing up clearly is this other dimension, where we can think about our service providers. Who are we giving our business to? And indeed, how inclusive are they? And then the second part she brings up, I wonder, Rita, if you can speak more to that. I think, again, because of our limited, what is the word you keep using? Consciousness on this continent. When we think about disability, we're always thinking about the visible. But I think what Flavia is really raising, and I could see even just from the list of some of your members, there's this whole other range of disabilities that are invisible, the neurodivergent issues, mental health issues. Can you speak a little bit more on those? Because many times we don't even realize, we don't think about those as disabilities. Can you speak more about those?
Yes, Taaka, I think that is an important point you're bringing up. Even in our advocacy, it becomes challenging for society to acknowledge issues about people whose impairments are not visible. So within our own organizations, and that's why the point on awareness is very important. You have a person with mental disability who goes to access a service, a public service, and then the person is asked to produce a card or something to show that there is an impairment, because the service provider is not seeing anything physical that relates with what she's describing. So many of these issues are usually not given the needed attention. So persons with impairments that are not visible do not get the appropriate recognition in society, and their issues take time to be given attention that is needed. In our schools, it takes time for such children to be identified and given the needed support. It takes time for them to be recognized. Usually, it takes parents and advocates to really push for such children to be given the needed attention in their schools. It runs down to our communities, to our family level, even within families. And sadly, such children are usually abused, or such persons are usually abused. So that we see more of abuse within people whose impairments are not visible. And so it's a very critical issue. And unfortunately, we don't have much data, for instance, in our Ghana situation, much data to support the argument. So the issue of data, and I want to push it as a recommendation to institutions, that as we build data generally within our workspace, we build data on disability, and ensure that that supports the work or the advocacy that we do in our institutions. Just bringing out another dimension, that within the disability categories, there are more marginalized groups. And so here we talk about women who are doubly disadvantaged. We talk about some groups like persons who are deafblind or with deaf blindness. We talk about persons who have not been able to come together or been identified to speak for themselves. So these are more marginalized or vulnerable groups within our communities. And as we work for persons with disabilities, again, that consciousness to identify the more marginalized groups, it's very important. Children are vulnerable within our community. So yes, it's a very critical issue.
Wow.
Really?
I don't know about you, but today we are learning so much. I think we should have done this a long time ago. But there's so much that we have not actually been conscious of. But today, Rita, you are helping us to do that. But what would you say to leaders who say that their companies cannot afford to be disability inclusive? They can't do this. What would you say to these leaders?
Yes, so we said that as leaders, we need to take conscious steps. We need to be conscious of whatever we do, because persons with disabilities and the disability advocacy and the agenda for inclusion will continue until such time that the law takes them on. So taking it from the legal perspective, there is a need for one to be more responsible, to include. The other part is that the world has come to accept disability. Disability is becoming a growing concept, and more persons in different categories are being identified. And so being inclusive is important for today and for tomorrow. So leaders should again be conscious of it. And thirdly, it is important to include now than tomorrow, because it is less expensive to include today. And that is all I'll say to leaders, because I've already, my earlier presentation talks about a number of points which are very relevant for the leaders that we're speaking to. Yeah.
And we will never forget what you said, is that it becomes expensive when you don't plan. When you plan for disability inclusion in the first place, then it becomes less expensive. Thank you for that. I see Stigmata would like to ask a question. Stigmata coming in from Dar es Salaam. Was it Arusha? Stigmata, where are you, Dada?
I'm in there.
Okay, welcome.
Thank you very much. Rita, you rock. Thank you so very much. It has been a learning session from the beginning until now. And I'm excited because at the Africa Philanthropy Network, we realize that the funding that is coming from the Global North, it's not always supportive to the cause we have. And sometimes it comes with a lot of ties, and we really are looking to decolonize that funding space. And us, together with our members, we are working to promote individual philanthropy, because we know African gives, much as it's not that much structured, and community philanthropy, because we believe there are so many assets. And my question to you is the thinking that we have now, and how, help us to know how can we strategically work with the field to support responsive resourcing for the field? Because the recognition that people with disability are one of the marginalized groups is there. So there are so many policies and laws that have been enacted, and that bravo for the voices of the group. But also there is a lot of resources that is coming, but most of it that is coming from the Global North, what we hear is it is helping us to build capacity. While I know people like yourself, Rita, are full of capacities. So we really need to make use of those capacity over and above employment. Because we know also amongst the groups of people living with disability, like in Tanzania, we have 10, there are those who are marginalized. How can we work with the field, regardless of talking about, one side don't leave anyone behind, but the other side, there is this motto that says, nothing for us without us. How can we work together to ensure that there is responsive resourcing for the field as leaders? Because I think we have double roles here, to employ, but those will be very few. There are so many who are left, will be left. How can we work together on this to build this movement of solidarity? Please help.
So I think that's a big point. And it seems to be a more general issue that cuts across a number of countries in our continent. We see that we have windows of opportunities for resources, but the element of disability inclusion, and sometimes it's not covered. We have resources that come to our national level. Again, disability not covered. We even have another point at the field, on the field where we have our groups, where we have civil society organizations, and the point or the question comes, how do we work with them? How do we get them to cooperate, to work together to make impact? So using our experience here in Ghana, we've had sessions with and engagements with the more kind of diplomatic community, the donor community, to begin to have, to have conversations about disability inclusion and what it means. And so the evidence, the data we build to justify or to support the conversations, the cases of people, we do that. We have done that and we've seen some positive responses. So now in most of the opportunities or some of the opportunities in Ghana, we see the element of inclusion, disability inclusion. And that's why I'm happy that the representative from African Women Development Fund talked about it. It's been many years. I think organizations of persons with disabilities try to work to get some institution to support the disability agenda, but now we are there. So sometimes it takes time, but as we are consistent in pushing and advocating, we can get there. Again, working on the field, we know that in some of our organizations, we say nothing about us without us. But we also say that in addition to that, we should not present it to mean nothing about us unless by us. You understand? And so it is about getting to understand the kind of dimensions and categorizations and the context within which the disabled people organizations work. Sometimes there may be issues that we will push as civil society or as partners, which may not be the main priority for the organizations. It's because they may have critical issues, they may have high expectations from their membership on the field, and they need to ensure these expectations are addressed. And in reality, when some of the expectations are addressed, it goes a long way to respond to some of the expectations or the initial plans that the partners want to bring in. So giving a practical example, when we started in Ghana, we started the advocacy for women with disabilities to have space at the community level. And that advocacy took some time. I mean, generally it was for persons with disabilities, but as I said earlier, there was also the need for us to ensure that the more marginalized and more vulnerable groups within the disability context are also catered for. And so in doing that, we had to work on other processes from another side to ensure that it responds, they come together to respond to the diverse needs and make impact in the lives of persons with disabilities. So working with partners, working with disabled people organizations, it's more about the understanding, the awareness, and then we can work together more.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, I wish we could go on and on and on. Thank you so much. I see we're reaching the top of the hour. I don't want to stop. Vera, can I do a quick summary of what we're hearing as we wrap up? And then I'll hand over to you to close. Huh?
Please go ahead. I forgot about the time.
Because it's been so interesting. Rita, you've been absolutely amazing. And I'm hoping this is not the end of the conversation, but we'll be continuing to think of different ways we can all be more disability inclusive leaders. But these are some of the key things I think that have been coming out of the conversation. Huh? We've made a key point about it's so important to start with awareness, shifting mindsets around disabilities. That's a key starting point. You talk about this shifting of consciousness. You then have said it's important if we're organizational leaders to have a policy in place. Huh? If we have a policy in place, then you plan accordingly. You plan to be disability inclusive. If you don't plan, it's going to be more expensive later. So we're clear on that. You've talked about then when you have a plan, then you need to implement. And implementation will look like different things, either whether it means physically getting the environment ready, whether it means website access, whether it means changing the recruitment, lots of different things. And then you talked about the importance of having data. And I can imagine how data is so important to track progress and accountability on all those commitments. We've also talked about the importance of thinking beyond just our staff and customers. It's key, both internally, externally, but also to think about the service providers, leverage the resources we've had. That has also come up. We've talked about the importance of thinking beyond visible disabilities. And I think Flavia raised and you elaborated on these disabilities that we don't see, but are equally powerful. You talked about the importance as we do all of this, we need to be involving people with disabilities as we think through the planning, the processing, thinking through, and we had some wonderful examples, for instance, of Unilever, AWDF, companies, organizations that have brought people in to help them think through this differently. We've just finished talking about resourcing, and we can't forget this issue you talked about, the intersectionality. So you might find that some people with disabilities are even more marginalized because they have double identities, they're children, they're living in poverty. So even that, we need to be particularly mindful of that. So it's been a lot, Rita. We can't thank you enough. You've been absolutely amazing, inspired so many of us, all of those. And in fact, let me leave Vera to thank everybody on the call. My job is to thank Rita so much for coming on. Rita, thank you. Back to you, Vera.
One last point before Vera comes in.
Yes, please.
Rita, go ahead.
As we work towards inclusion, it is important for us to understand that persons with disabilities are not entirely experts. Not all persons with disabilities are experts. And so it is important for us to understand this so we are able to engage more and better. There are people who don't believe that they are persons with disabilities. That is another conversation for another day. But thank you very much for this opportunity.
Oh, I wish we had some few more minutes for you to tackle that one. Because maybe they are not aware, or they are aware by self-denial. Just a word or two about that before we allow you to go.
Yes, so I mentioned that not all persons with disabilities are experts because that self-awareness is yet to be there. We're putting in efforts to get people to understand their impairments, and because some give in easily, the confidence level is low, and some see disability from the medical perspective that puts disability as a medical issue. And so if you come to our society within Ghana, some will say, I'm a sick person, I'm sick, I cannot do anything, you know? So that runs through, and there are many factors that get people to think that way. So
thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much. There's so much we need to talk about, but we want to say thank you to our Facebook guests. And again, thank you to Rita, and thank you to everybody on the call. It's a good number. Thank you for making time. If this is the first time you're joining us, welcome again. But please make it a point that the last Friday of every month, you will join us to do this. This is the Leadership Happy Hour, and we are so glad that you're making time for us today. Today, we looked at closing the disability gap through effective leadership, okay? And I hope you enjoyed everything. You learned so much. Taaka, thank you. Lydia, thank you. Muriel, thank you. This is the Busara team. Want to say thank you, and we have to.
Are we dancing?
Before we dance, please put on your cameras. Want to take a picture?
Oh, yes, thank you.
And then we dance.
Nice.
Awesome. Oh, nice.
Nice, got some good photos. Okay, now keep your cameras on to dance. Keep your cameras, you know how we leave dancing.
We are seeing more men coming in.
Okay, are we ready?
Before we finish, I just wanted to ask one question because I just joined today. It's my first day.
Welcome.
And I don't know how to follow this next time every Friday because I just joined through.
Wonderful.
Okay. So 2 ways. Please find us on Facebook, Busara Africa page. Again, we have our website, busara-africa.com. Okay. And then the third one, we have our programs manager, Lydia, on the call. She can, okay. So this is our website here. You can check from the chat.
Yeah, I got it. I just got it. Yeah.
Good. So Lydia is also on the call. If you want her to be sending you a reminder, she'll be glad to do that, okay?
I'll appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Welcome, welcome. We're ready to go.
Let's dance.
No need to let your body. If you know the God way. That's some baby dead body. Nobody be no baby. When you fall, you go stand up again. You try them again and again and again. Cause it's not easy. So they sing and they dance and the people they rejoice. My brother, my sister. Not be today. If you go to a party, you make we the tango. Baba don't know your